All right, cool. All right, so for today, you can see nested CRUD and Django. So I'm just going to basically walk through this README, and we can play around with stuff and make any modifications that we need to. So first, I'm going to create a virtual environment. And then I'll activate it and install Django. Okay, and while that goes, so this is another alternative. If you supply basically a file path, it will create, excuse me, it won't create that extra directory. So this is another option. You don't have to do it this way, but we'll just see what that looks like. So I don't have this, I don't have another old cohorts directory, and then inside that is the old cohorts and so on. So old cohorts is our project. And then we'll, excuse me, create our app. So old cohorts is the project. This is the top level, and then cohorts and students is one app within this project. So we'll go to do a couple of the housekeeping things we have to do with Django. So I'm going to go into the project, the settings, and I have to add that app. I'm going to stick with the SQLite database for now. I think everything else is fine. And we'll start by creating the models. So this is going to be a lot of copy pasting, but I'll stop and talk about things. And if you have questions about particular, feel free to jump in and ask. All right. Okay, so we have two models here for our app. We have a cohort and we have student. So what is the relationship between cohort and student?
A cohort can have many students, that's one too many, and a student can only belong to one cohort, so that's one to one.
Exactly. So you can see that the student is kind of marked with a cohort. So a student can only have one cohort, and a cohort can have potentially many students. Okay, why don't we go ahead and make this an actual date field? So date field. I'm not sure what the default options are for here, so let's see. Auto now. Let's do auto now. Auto created. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what all these variations are. That's something you could look up in the documentation, but we'll still get this for now. So start date should automatically get thrown in there for us. Okay, cool. So we'll roll with this for now. We'll probably have to modify some other things because we changed that. And so we'll run migrations. And Python manage.py migrate. Okay, nothing broke, so that's good. So now we're going to insert some test data just for us to work with locally. So we've seen a few different ways of doing this. This is fine if you have if there's a few examples that you want that are helpful for you. You can also randomly, we've seen, I've done this a few times, just randomly generate data. So we'll do it this way. So Python manage.py shell. So I don't have the Django extensions installed. So I'm just using the normal built-in Django shell here. And because I'm doing that, I'm going to have to specifically import the models that I want to use to insert. So if I were using Django extensions, I would all those imports would automatically be there for me. Okay. So I should have stuff saved to my database now. We'll see if that is actually true later. Okay. All right, so now we're gonna fill in the URLs. So this is the top level URLs, the project. And we have the typical, this comes for free, the admin route. And then we also have our own cohorts, which we're going to hand off to this app, students and cohorts.urls, which we don't have yet. So we'll create that file. And we'll copy this in there. And we can ignore this commented out stuff for now, but we have a very typical kind of CRUD structure here. So if you go to the base route, this is going to be a list view. So you'll make a GET request for all of the resources here. You can create a new resource. This is a post request. You can view an individual resource. So this is a GET request, but for a detail view, a specific thing. And then we have we can edit a particular resource. So this is update and then delete. So we have the full CRUD kind of expressed here in our routes. All right. Let me see. Okay, so let's go to views. We don't have a form yet, so we'll have to import that, but this is all very typical, right? So this is functional. Functional meaning kind of you're doing everything by hand, which could be good or bad. We have the list view, so we'll get all the cohorts and then throw it into a template. Here we're getting a particular one and throwing it into a template. So it's the same kind of pattern we've seen repeatedly. And then to create a new cohort, we're gonna have to branch. So the same function, the same view function is gonna handle GET requests and POST requests. If it's a GET request, that's the initial request there. It'll give you an empty form. And if it's a POST request, that means you're submitting a filled out form. So this, what does this form.save commit equals false do?
Does it save it to the database?
Yeah, so this basically will allow you to add more things. So if you wanted to, on the back end, add or modify or do something else to the model before you save it, then this is how you do it. You get access to the model, excuse me, but it's not actually committed, so it's not finally stored to the database. So if the examples we've seen is basically the most common kind of thing you'll do is you'll add a user. So if we have a blog post and we have a foreign key to the user, as in the currently logged in user, you don't want the currently logged in user to have to fill in that information in the form itself. You just want the user to fill out information relating to the blog post, and then on the back end you will get the information about the user from the request itself, not the user directly, and then you'll insert that. So you would do cohort equals form.save and then cohort dot user equals self dot, or in this case I think just self request dot user whatever. So as is, this is not really doing anything, but this is kind of there to show you that you could potentially be doing other stuff there. Okay, so I think the rest of this is fairly straightforward. Excuse me. All right, so let's create the form that we are missing from the import. So we're expecting something called .forms. And we're using the model form. So we're gonna let Django do all the work here. We just supply it a model and then the fields that we want to show up in the model. So for actually, I think we don't want, let me see. Oh, these are both these are both dates. So I'm gonna leave this. I'm gonna remove this. So this should get automatically populated when a row is saved. So I'm just gonna remove that from the form. So I don't want anyone to have to do that. Okay. All right, so now we're gonna add some templates. So templates, cohorts and students, and then cohorts list. So this will show us every single cohort. So go here. This is the typical Django expected structure. And this is called cohorts list. All right, so we have this URL template and we have an A tag here, and we're using some Django magic basically to dynamically get the URL here. So cohort detail is not, not the actual function. So URL is a function that Django is going to call, and cohort detail is going to be an argument that gets passed to that. So cohort detail, what is that? That is, in URLs, that is the name that you've given to your route. So cohort detail, it happens to have the same name as the view function, but it's actually a named reference to this. So it's basically gonna act as though you've started here. So if you're a client and you're making a request, you're gonna make a request and it's gonna get parsed and it's gonna show up here. It's gonna say, okay, yeah, you went to / what's our base route here? / cohorts / some number. So this is going to get picked up and then it's going to call this for you. But from the A tag, it's basically going to start. It's going to start from here. So it's going to start from here. It's going to call the cohort detail. And if we look at the actual cohort detail, the cohort detail expects a parameter. So we can't just call the cohort detail as is. We have to pass it a parameter. So it's expecting an ID. So we have to supply that, and that's what's happening here. So this is a keyword parameter, cohort underscore ID, which is the same name as, in this case, it has to be the same name as the parameter you give it here because it's a keyword argument. And this cohort dot ID, where's that coming from?
That's coming from the URL.
From the model, right?
Or yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, indirectly, it is. It could be coming from the URL.
It's coming from the data we pulled in.
Yeah, so we're actually getting that from our database. So someone goes to the. We've pulled out every single cohort, and we're creating a bunch of of A tags, which are going to link to detail views. And we're saying for every cohort, so this is for every row, every cohort row in our, our query set of cohort rows, you're going to grab the cohort.id. And we can look in our models. So here's the migration, which you should never really need to look at, but you can see Django has Django by default will give you an ID field, and it'll make it an auto incrementing integer. So we have an ID field here, and that's where this ID is coming from. Okay, so we've got that, and let's see, yeah. So the cohort detail. So these A tags are going to link to this right here. We'll create a cohort detail. And we're going to get, so let's look at the view real quick for the detail. So it's going to grab a cohort. So here we have a helper function, but it's just going to call objects.get the cohort ID. So we're going to have our row, or our instance of our model, however you want to think about it. And then it's going to render this template, which we've just pasted in, and it's going to give it the cohort. So cohort name, you have start date, and then this is just formatting, and then the end date. And then this is also going to have an A tag, and this is going to call the named route edit cohort. And we can be sure that that's there, edit cohort. And if we look at the view associated with it, we can see what parameters it's going to need. So edit cohort is also going to take the cohort ID. So we have to make sure we supply that in the A tag here. So edit is going to call edit cohort and cohort.id. So we could just hard code this route. So this is going to end up being, cohorts slash slash my cohort slash edit slash 2 or whatever. So you could just hard code that, and that would be fine and it would work. The one reason why you might not do that is that if you ever changed this route, or for example, you decided to use not the ID but a UUID or a slug or something else, which we'll look at in a little bit, then you would have to go through everywhere in your HTML and change all that stuff rather than keeping it very simple and the changes are localized. So this is the tool that Django gives you to minimize basically some tedious work. Okay, so here we have a form, and Django forms are kind of peculiar in some ways. So you don't actually get the full form, but here we're saying it's going to be a post request, and then the action is going to be where you get redirected to. So if you so this is basically like an empty form. It just has a submit button in it. It's just like delete. There's no real information to supply. There's no real information to supply in part because we're grabbing it. We already have the ID of the resource, so we don't need to ask the user for that again. So if you click on the submit button here, and we'll see all this once we actually run the server, but it'll make a post request to this delete cohort named route, and it will pass in the ID of the resource that you want to delete. All right, so here is the form. So this is not the delete form, this is the save form. So cohort form. This does not go there. Okay, so here is a post request. We have to include the CSRF token. Can anyone tell me what the CSRF token is?
Is it an encryption type that the website, the project will recognize and allow you to post to the database?
Yeah, basically. Yeah, so it's not, I wouldn't say it's an encryption type exactly. It's actually it's called a nonce, NONCE. And it's just basically an arbitrary string of alphanumeric characters that so here's a problem that it's trying to solve. So if I have my server running, right, I have my server running and I accept requests from anywhere because I'm a web server. So anyone on their any client in the world on whatever IP address can make a request to me. So that's kind of a typical web server. What you don't want to happen is for people to, for example, I want to make a post request to you, but I haven't actually, I'm just making a post request kind of out of nowhere. So I haven't like gone through the process. I'm not logged in, you haven't given me blah, blah, blah. So the server only wants to accept a filled out form that it itself has given to a client. And this is a way of making sure the server is basically stamping this form with something that it knows. So it's going to give the form an ID basically that it knows about, and it's going to send the form along. So anytime someone submits a form to the server, it can basically check, did I initially send you this form? And if the answer is no, then it can just disregard it. So it's just a way of it's a level of security to make sure that it's only accepting forms that it itself has sent out. Okay. All right, so let's see if this works now. Shockingly, after all that copy pasting, it actually works. Okay, let's go to cohorts. So here is our list view. And there's just a couple here. So I can click on this. This is going to give me /1. So /1 is the cohort. And I can edit it or delete it. If I delete it, it's going to make a post request. I should be able to see if I inspect. You can see the CSRF token right here. This is just basically, it just needs to be, this is just like an ID for the form, basically, the server is giving it. We can see the action. So that function that we passed in, we'll look at it real quick. Is this the detail? I think, yeah. Yeah. So here we are. This is the form that we're actually looking at. So the CSRF token we see comes from here. It adds this extra hidden input field. So name CSRF middleware token and value blah blah blah. So that's what this is doing. It's adding that field. And then we have the action. So we pass it this function URL with the named route. So it's going to call this cohort ID. All that is going to get dynamically translated into just this relative path. So this URL. Okay, and if we were to click on this, it would make post requests. We can edit it. We'll just make sure that this works. So the start date, you can see that this automatically populated for us. Looks like it's in a different format here because this is a string, so but I'm not going to worry about that. But our start date is getting automatically populated, so that's what we expect. Okay. So far that seems to be working. Let's see here. Okay, so now we're gonna actually fill out the rest of those routes. So what we've seen so far is fairly typical. We have a single resource and we need to access it. We're going to now look at all this other stuff. So I'll just copy this to make sure. Let's extend this. Okay. So we have all these routes that we had initially, so up to delete. But now, because our cohorts and students are connected, you know, there's a one-to-many relationship. You can have a cohort with many students. So for any given cohort, you could have lots of students. So now we can start to express that relationship through the URL. So we can go to cohorts/1/students, and we can get all of the students that are in this cohort. And same thing with new. So we basically are just gonna stack the same CRUD pattern just on top of, we're just gonna assume that we're filtering by a particular cohort. So you can create a new student in this cohort. You can get a detail view of a particular student in this cohort. You can edit a particular student in this cohort, and you can delete a particular student in this cohort. So there's really, I mean, that's pretty much all there is to it. If you understand the database model, this is just another way of expressing that relationship. But we have a URL to do that, and the URL has its, has its particular limitations. Okay. All right, so we're gonna add handlers, so view functions for all those new routes that we have. Form. Get rid of this. Cool. All right, so let's take a look at what we have now. So we have the usual routes, and then we also have, let's say, the student list. So let's see. The student. Let me check this URLs. Okay, correct. All right, so if in order to see a list of all the students, we're assuming that we're already within a particular cohort. So we need the cohort ID to know which particular cohort that we're in, and then we want to see all of the students that belong to that particular cohort. So you can get the cohort ID, and then we can actually grab all of the students that belong to that cohort. So there's a couple ways of doing this. This is kind of showing you the most kind of step-by-step clear way of doing it. There's other ways you could do it, but this is fine for now. So you'll get the cohort, and then you'll get all the students in that cohort. All right, let's add this into the cohort detail. And this is the same thing we've seen. So we're assuming that we're already within a given cohort, and we're going to get all of the students. And student detail. Let's see.
Do you already have a cohort detail? HTML?
Sorry.
I think you already have an HTML file for
Oh.
cohort detail.
Oh yeah. Okay. Thank you. Let's see. All right, let me do this. So template students. And this is student detail.html. Okay, so we're gonna get the, let's see, student detail. So we can edit a student, you can delete a student, you can see the properties of a student. And then the student form, there's some more copy pasting, and then we'll take a look at everything. Student form. And students list. Computer is really slowing down here. All right, so let's make sure that this works. I'm gonna stop this and restart it. Okay, nothing obviously broken. So let's start at the beginning. So cohorts, I can see a cohort. I can, it's like there's no students in that cohort. So let's see. Cohorts, 1 students. Students list.
I think you replaced the original cohort detail with the new HTML, which is just that.
Yeah. So let me see. Let's go back to the, oh, I was supposed to add this to the end, my bad. Cohort detail, right? Copy pasting. Start that. Okay, all cohorts. Now I see a particular cohort, and below that, yeah. So I get students in this cohort. But now I have this issue. Let's see. I'm missing cohorts and students list.html. Let me try putting this in here. Trailing slash, okay. Students in this cohort, okay. So I think it's just where I'm putting those things. Okay, and then I basically like starting from here. So it's just a a repetition, so it's the same CRUD, but now for students, it's just stacked on top of, it's assuming the context of cohorts, basically. I'm gonna have to, I think, move all these things in here. Name student is not defined.
Should it be looking in the students template?
Did you import the student class
The student class
in
from,
the views?
let me see. I did not. All right. Thank you, guys. Okay. So cohorts 1 and then students 1, and then I can perform all the usual CRUD stuff from here. So this is terrible, obviously, but we'll leave it for now. This gets updated. So that's basically nested CRUD is just CRUD that kind of assumes the context of another resource. So everything that's happening in students assumes that they're in. So it's basically filtered by cohort 1. Okay, are there any questions?
If you're adding now new students, you have to specify which cohort first, right?
Yeah, so if you're adding a new student, let's see if we can go. I think it's new. You have to specify a cohort.
Okay, it's here, there already, I see.
So it, this is still a little janky, but what we'd want to do is basically force, if you're here, cohorts 1, students new, you should only be able to create a student within cohort 1. So under the hood on the back end, we should basically be choosing that for you and not allow the user to do that. Because this is not really a free choice. We're in the context of cohorts 1.
Yeah, I see.
So if I go, let's see, students, new student. So let me look at the student form. So cohort, so if I remove cohort from the student form, and let me look at the student form. Okay. And then in the view, I should be able to get, let's see. So here I would need to grab that. I think you can get that. Let me just look this up. So URL. Probably pass that in as another parameter. Actually, let me see. So if we're in the form, we're gonna save it. Yeah, we'll just do it this way. There's a couple ways we could do that. Let's see, request.get full path. This probably won't be the most efficient way to do it, but let's just see if that works. So I'll print Okay, so we'll go back here. The new student. And I don't see that that cohort is an option now. So I'm going to add new student and save. Not null constraint. So that's expected because we have removed that. But I just want to see if we get this printed. Okay, so here we go. So I'm sure that there's a better way to do this, but just off the top of my head, I'm going to do this the dumb way, which is I'm just going to split this string and grab this first thing. So request dot get full path and dot split. I'm going to split it based on a slash and I guess I'll get the first one element. So I'll just make sure this is correct. Again, I'm sure that there's a better way to do this in Django, which I could look up, but I'm just doing this off the cuff right now. And let's see, cohorts. So I need to go one more. So let's make that 2. And I'm going to assume that that works. And so then what I'm going to do is, let's see, student dot cohort. Let me see, check my model again. So I call this cohort. And I might have to get the actual cohort itself, not just the ID, but I'll see if this works. Okay, so back in my view, student.cohort equals and we'll supply that in. Okay, so should be good now. Let's try that again. Okay, so I'm gonna have to create an actual cohort instance. So I just passed this ID. I need to create a cohort instance. So I'm gonna have to access that. So I'm gonna use the get cohort method so I can get an actual instance of a cohort. So get cohort. Where am I here? Edit student. Create student. Okay, so I'm going to do get cohort with the cohort ID. Okay, so now that actually works. So this is what so you know, some of what's on this README is there to kind of show you explicitly the pattern, but you know, you would actually want to do something more like this, where since you're already here, you're kind of assuming that whatever student you're adding is already in this cohort. So you don't want to give, you know, if instead of being nested, the students were at the top level, then yeah, then you would do that because a student could belong to any cohort. You're kind of creating a student from scratch. But here, you're not really starting from scratch. You're starting from within a cohort. So you could do it. So, I mean, this is another issue where these this REST pattern, this way of doing this is just a pattern. You could do whatever you want. You know, in theory, you know, you can do whatever you want, but following the sensible pattern is usually a good idea. But it is just a convention. Any questions about that? Okay, yeah, so let's take a break and then we'll come back and I'm gonna show you guys how we can customize it. Instead of just using IDs from the database, we'll do something else. All right, so come back in 10 minutes. All right, cool. So we have our nested CRUD app, which is all working, but the issue is that we're kind of well, are there any potential problems with this setup using IDs in the URL?
I guess it makes it visible for whoever to find out what's the way the database is structured or something like that.
Yeah. So it lets people know how it's structured. It since it's based on an auto incrementing ID, it can also give you, your competitors can have a good idea of how many customers or how many students are in this program or whatever. So you're basically leaking information that you're not intending to leak. So that's the main issue. Another side issue is that this is not maybe very meaningful or helpful to someone looking at this. So if you wanted to bookmark this URL, or you are relying on like search engine optimization or something like that, the number 7 is not really very helpful information, whereas a student's name might be, or an article title, or whatever the actual resource is. This can help search engines find what you're looking for, find what other people are looking for as well. Okay, so let's do a couple things. So I'm going to change the cohort ID. I'm no longer going to use ID here. I'm going to, instead of using an auto incrementing ID, I'm going to use a UUID. So a UUID is basically just a big random hash. So its only purpose is to just be a unique blob. All right, so let's go in here, and I'm gonna have to go to the models and get rid of all this stuff. All right, so I go to my model, and in as we know, Django will by default add an ID field, but you can override that. So Django UUID. Let's see. We'll just look at this result. So there is a UUID field that comes with Django, and you can override. We're basically going to override the ID. So looking at the model, just as a reminder, this ID field is going to get created. So we're going to override this, and we're going to make sure it's the primary key. So primary key is true, and then default. This is important because this basically, if we look at the other model, it's an auto incrementing number, which means it's going to get generated every time. So we basically need to supply a default value. So every time we create a new row in our model, it's going to call this method, which we're going to import, and it's going to give us some gibberish. So we'll just look at what that actually gives us. I'm going to exit from the server, and I'm going to go into the Python shell here and import UUID. It's from the standard library. I can call, and this gives me this. And if I call it again, it should just give me another random one. And The only purpose is just that this is not like significant in any way, it just needs to be unique. So I'm just gonna copy this. Go here. And I have to import. So this is from the Python standard library. All right, so I'm not gonna try and deal with the migration there. So I'm just gonna, this is a pretty drastic change. So I'm just gonna delete the database and start over. All right, and now I'm going to insert, I'm gonna go back to the README. I'm gonna insert that fake data. Here's that. Here. Okay. And I'm gonna run the server again. And we will see if this works. So I have an issue here. So reverse match, let me see. Check if I get the same error. Okay, good. So cohort detail. This keyword arguments, blah, 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 blah. So I have an issue now, and this is a lot, this looks like a lot of gibberish here, but it's saying basically that there's a cohort ID, which we should have. So I can hook up the admin. Let me just hook up the admin terminal so we can see more clearly what's going on. The admin and dot site register. This will be we'll create a super user, Python manage.py, create super user. And I run the server. Go copy this. All right, so now we're in the admin. I'm going to log in with my recently created super user. And then I can check out the cohorts. So I changed the ID to use this UUID. So this is actually what's showing up there. So we can see in the database that it's actually working. So the change we made is actually correct. But our router doesn't like this. So we told our router to expect an integer. We look here at the URLs. We basically said, so it's actually looking for this in an HTML form, but that's fine. So this cohort ID is supposed to be an integer. But it's not an integer now, it's a UUID. So we're gonna have to modify this. What is the keyword here? No, it must be command. All right. So this, by the way, this like this int colon blah blah blah. This is just a regular expression, and if you look at older versions of Django, it was more explicitly just a regular expression. So this is Django is now expecting cohort ID not to be an integer, but to be a UUID. Let's see if that works. And it does. So if I hover over Bravo, you can see it's going to go to cohort / E7 blah, blah, blah. So everything basically works the same way. It's just we're not using a number now. We're using a random hash. So has anyone done any web scraping?
Like a tiny bit, not even enough to really talk about.
Okay, cool. Well, if you haven't, I would recommend giving it a try. It's kind of an interesting experience. Makes you feel like a hacker. But so I actually for my personal project, I created a fake horoscope generator, and in order to train a like a text generation model, I had to pull in a bunch of horoscopes. And so this is a problem with any, this is an issue with any machine learning task is you need some data. So how do you get a bunch of horoscopes that's, basically that I can put into a text document? And so web scraping is a good way to do that, but it's difficult to find a site where you can just scrape everything on it. So eventually I found a site that was structured in the way that we had this structured before, where I think it was actually based on date, but the date would just auto increment. So I could basically write a for loop or something, and then the URL would match. So there was a regular pattern that I could detect and implement in code. That way I could scrape everything on the site. Now, maybe if you're running the site, you don't want people to be able to do that. So that's one reason why you might want to do something like this. You make it harder for people to just kind of automate web scraping. Okay. All right, so we now have that changed to a UUID. So the other change we wanted to make is we want student, instead of just being, students, if I go here, students in this cohort. So this is still students /1. So I could make this also a UUID, but for the sake of variety, let's make this a slug. So a slug is just a URL safe string. So there's only a subset of strings that can be part of a URL. So a slug is basically, we're going to take some meaningful information from our model, like, for example, first name and last name, or maybe first name, last name, cohort, or something like that. And we're going to process the string and make sure that it's URL safe. So if any URL unsafe characters will be replaced by URL safe characters. And then we'll use that as part of the URL instead of just one or whatever. Okay, so Django has a built-in field for that, which shouldn't be too surprising at this point. Let me just do slug field. Let me see if the Django docs have this. Surprised that Django docs don't come up, since they're pretty good. All right, well, whatever. We'll just look at this first. Oh, actually, it's the second result. Never mind. All right, cool. So we have a slug field. You read the description. So slug is a newspaper term. A slug is a short label for something containing only letters, numbers, underscores, or hyphens. They're generally used in URLs. So you have max length, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so let's take a look. You can add a new field here. So slug equals models dot slug field. And it looks like max length. I'll just set it to some random thing. Now, the thing is, we don't, so kind of like ID, we don't want any users to be able to create this or modify it, right? We want this to be under our control completely. So, you know, cohorts don't get to decide what ID they are. They don't even know about it. They don't even need to know they have an ID. It's just something that we handle on the back end. And same thing with Slug. So Slug is something that we want to handle on the back end. And we don't want users to have any control over, in part because, you know, if you could create your own Slug, then, you know, it would just be an extra hassle. The problem is that the Slug field needs to be derived from other information. So the Slug field, let's say we want it to be a combination of, you know, first name, last name, and cohort name, or something like that. We don't have access to that stuff right here. So this is on the same level. So we need to do this somewhere else. We need to add this Slug field somewhere where we have access to the other fields. And there are a few places you can do that, but I'm going to override the save method. And when I override the save method, I should have access now to the model's first name, last name, and maybe the cohort name. So what I want to do is create a URL safe slug from those three elements. I could write my own method pretty easily to process that, you know, make everything lowercase, you know, replace spaces with dashes, blah, blah, blah. But that's kind of tedious, and there's already something built in. Let's see if it. Okay. So here from Django.utils.text, slugify. So we just give it a string. So it converts a string to a URL. So we can just give it a string and it will take care of converting it for us. So I'm going to import this. Self.slug equals slugify. And then I think we just need to pass it one string. So we could do first self.first name. Last name and self.cohort name. And then anytime you override a method in Django, it's a good idea to call super on it. So you let Django take care of its built-in stuff. So we're going to call super, not save. So okay. So let's see. So this shouldn't be a breaking migration, but I think I'm gonna wipe it and start all over because these slugs for currently existing fields, these slugs are just gonna be null. So I'm gonna wipe the database again, just because I'm lazy. And I'm gonna run make migrations and migrate. And then I'm gonna paste in those examples. And I will run the server. I'm gonna lose my super user, but that's fine. We should be able to see what's going on. So I'm gonna go back. This UUID is almost certainly not going to be the same one. So cohorts, that's fine. Bravo gets a new ID, and then students in this cohort. I see this, and if I click on, okay. So this will work. So the student itself should actually have the UUID field now, but I'm still using the ID in the URLs. So what I'm going to do is I need to change this from an int to a slug. And I'm also going to have to make some other changes. So we will probably, I think, yeah. Let's see here. So if I click on someone, run this again. We'll go back there. See all the students. And I'm still getting the student ID. So I'm gonna have to go into the HTML and change the templates. So cohort list, cohort detail, student list. So instead of passing in the, I think cohort ID is still fine. Yep. And then student detail. Student dot slug. And the student form shouldn't be changed. Student list. This is going to be slug. And I think that should be good. So I'll restart this just to be sure, because I changed, HTML. All right, so I refresh this. And okay, good. Okay, file ID expected, a number. So the URL part works. Now we're getting another error. Okay, so it's trying to get the student based on the UUID. So I can go and change that. It's happening in views line 55. All right, so I'm trying to get the student. Actually, in this case, get student. So instead of doing that, I can just get it by slug. So student dot objects get slug equals. This is also confusing because I'm still trying to minimize the amount of things I have to change. So This is now a slug, not really an ID, but there you go. Okay, so this now works. There might be a couple changes, but I would want to refactor this to now express the reality of what's happening. But in the interest of time, just we now have a different expression for our URL. So this is the UUID, and this is a student. So if we wanted to use this slug, internally in our database as a way of identifying resources, we would also probably need to put a unique constraint on here. So in our model, could make this unique, add a unique requirement, or make it unique within a given cohort or something like that. But yeah, that's basically it. So we have nested routes and customized URLs. Any questions about that?
So I know with some languages you can like do a post and hide everything in the URL. Would that not also be something you could do here, or would you be able to still decipher the redirect in the URL even with like a post?
So you're breaking up a little bit. Are you asking about making a post request instead of including all this information in the URL?
No. So some languages, I know like in PHP it's called post and it hides everything in the URL. So is that not something you could do in this situation to hide everything in the URL, or would you still be able to decipher it even with that?
What do you mean hide everything in the URL?
Like when you go to localhost/cohort/whatever, it'll just show localhost. It won't show cohorts in the UUID and then students column.
Oh, I see. So it's like a single page app.
Well, no, it just hides what shows in the URL. It's so like you're navigating to, the program knows where you're going, and so when you click on delete student, instead of showing you in the browser bar where it's going, it hides all that, so you don't see any of it. Like the user doesn't see any of it.
So are you saying that as a user, if I typed in this, nothing would happen, or
As a user, yeah. So as a user, you type in that, and it'll take you directly there, but you don't see. I mean, so it wouldn't really work like that. You wouldn't type it in. So if you go to the first page, like cohorts, when you hover over, so hit, so like if you click on Bravo, right, it'll take you there, but it doesn't show in the browser bar the URL. It just like you're just there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. It sounds like a single page app basically, where you're I mean, I'm not familiar with PHP, so it might not be doing the same thing, but you can do something similar in React, where you're basically you're not really using the router. Everything is one page, so there really aren't any routes exactly, but you change what you show based on
Like what they click and interact with.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Okay.
for
So there's no
example,
way to like hide what's in the URL bar.
there should be. I mean, that's something that you can configure. It kind of you have to change how you're routing it. So as it is right now with Django, the router is using what's in the URL. So if you changed or modified what's in the URL, then your router would get confused. So you would probably have to. I mean, you'd have to tweak this. I mean, yeah, something like that would definitely be doable in Django, but that wouldn't be the default pattern. You probably have to just do like a wildcard and accept anything for any route, and then anytime a request comes in anywhere, you would hand it off to maybe some kind of like initial dispatcher. So you would actually do your dispatching in the views. You'd have like a decide which other view method to call method, and then from there it could, you know, handle whatever, maybe if it has information in the elsewhere in the request.
Okay, cool, thanks. Yeah, I was just curious if there was a similar way to kind of do that.
Yeah, yeah, Django's not really set up that way. You can do that easily in React. And I'm not, you know, I apologize. I'm not 100% sure. You know, I don't actually know anything about PHP. So. All right, any other questions?
Yes. Oh, you can go first.
Oh, thank you. Could you explain again what happened when you overwrote the save function for the student model?
Yeah. So here, so the problem that you guys did this a little bit with when we initially Django, we did like validations and stuff like that. The problem is that this slug field is dependent on these other fields, right? So this slug field needs to use the name, the last name, and the first name, and the cohort, but it doesn't have access to it immediately because it's on the same level, right? So it needs kind of a global, you need a global view on all the information you have in the model before you can actually create this slug. So save, you know, when you actually create a new instance or a new row in your student database, there are a whole bunch of methods and functions that are going to get called, just like a whole life cycle. And at some point, save is going to be one of those methods. And at this point, it just so happens that this the instance has access to cohort first name and last name. So basically what's happening is when you initially create a student, this slug field is going to be null. So slug field is not telling you that, but this is basically a nullable field. So we could maybe even mark that explicitly, null equals true, but I think Django is handling that under the hood because it's a slug field. And so when you initially create it, you're saying cohort is this, first name is this, last name is that, and slug is null. And then it's going to go through its process. It's going to check and make sure, it's going to validate everything. Is this good? Is this, you know, meet all the constraints, blah, blah, blah. So it's calling all these different methods. It's working its way through this, you know, whole cycle. And then at some point it's going to call save. And then you're saying, okay, now I want to actually not make this null anymore. I want to make this a real value. And at this point, you have access to the other fields. Does that make sense, or does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. That helped a lot.
So you can also, you know, as you're doing validation, there's basically two kinds of validation you can do. One is like field specific. So for example, last name, I could say last name has to start with a capital letter. So I could write a validator that checks that, and it only needs to know about the last name, right? I just say, does the last name start with a capital letter? If so, you're good. If not, then I throw an error. But there's another kind of validation, which would be something like the last name can't be the same as the first name. So now I need to know about two different fields at the same time. So last name can't be the same as first name. Well, I can't validate this field unless I know about this one already, but I don't have access to that, you know, when it's first, you know, when you first create an instance, basically. So you have to wait. You have to hook into another method that's called later, and then at that point, you can check the first name and the last name and do the validation there. So this is doing something similar, or we're not validating it, but we are using other fields. So this field is dependent on other fields. Elijah, did you have a question?
Yes, sir. I was just gonna ask if it would be possible you would make the code available from our example today, because I
Sure.
was working alongside you, and once we added the unique ID,
Yeah.
somehow I ended up I broke my database, and I was trying to, I guess, rebuild it, and I tried to get rid of the migrations and then rerun it, but now the folder for migrations won't repopulate. So that's something I guess I need to figure out how, if I break my
Yeah.
project, to rebuild it. But
Yeah. So the first thing I would check is make sure that if you delete migrations, you don't delete the init. So your migrations needs to have an dunder init.py file in it. And then if you're using SQLite, just make sure you also delete the SQLite database here.
okay, thank you. Does
Yeah.
the init.py file have to be empty?
Yes.
Okay, I think that's what I'm missing, but I'm not sure. I might have to play around with it
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
the side.
That's just my initial, like, you know, it's kind of a gotcha. So the init.py lets it lets Python treat this as a module, and the way that Django works is it assumes that it's there, so it won't be able to import or it won't be able to use this properly if you don't have the init.py there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if that's not the issue, just let me know. I'm happy to troubleshoot.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Any other questions?
By the way, John, I was looking at some URL, and then I see that some of them they use like a question mark.
Yeah.
Is that just equivalent of a slash, or it's different?
Yeah, it's different. So like question mark
Yeah, something like that.
name equals Bob or something. So this is called a query parameter. And this is so there's a couple ways of sending information to a route. So if I want to make a request to /cohorts, I could make a post request, for example, and I could include stuff in the body. Like, you know, if you fill out a form, you end up making a post request, and all the form information gets put in the body of the request and then sent along. If you're making a GET request and you want to send information to a particular route, then you typically will use this pattern, which is a query parameter. So if I go to /cohorts, if my route is set up to handle this, then you can actually pull out these things. And then, so if you go to Google, you know, google.com, whatever, I don't know why I searched for that, apples. Notice here, so it's google.com/search, and then there's a question mark, right? Question mark Q equals apples. And then there's a bunch of other stuff you don't need to worry about. But Q equals apples. So this is what I put in the form, right? So this tells you, so this is a key value pair. So the query, you know, Q is apples. So then Django, you know, Google's backend will parse that URL and say, okay, internally it's going to make a request in its own database and say, you know, give me stuff with apples. And then it'll send that back. So that's what that's doing here. I'm making a GET request, but I'm sending some extra information to the backend server.
Thank you.
Okay, all right. We'll stop here.